Okay, History 7. This is our video for March 6th. I like to always check where I'm at on the calendar. I hope you guys like this chapter. I really like it. Unfortunately, like in a lot of my studies, I've never gotten to really study Africa, so this is just super interesting to me. You know, what happened to Africa after slavery ends, and they no longer have that major conflict going on. And so it's pretty interesting to kind of see what's happening in Africa and stuff. So I really like reading this chapter. I don't actually have any videos for you today except for this one. So that's kind of exciting for you. I hope to add some more things later. This chapter, it is kind of interesting to see just some different things in here that I've never studied. So I hope you guys like this chapter as well. So this is just kind of a little background on the slave trade, and then we get into what happens after. So before 1600, and this just kind of gives you like how things changed very quickly. Before 1600, about 2,000 slaves were captured each year by African raiders, and then they were taken from the coast of Africa by Europeans. And then within 180 years, this trade had expanded to over 70,000 slaves a year. So from 2,000 to 70,000. So that can just be devastating to these nations here. The settlement of America was the major reason for this growth. These numbers don't even take into account the slaves that were taken by Middle Eastern slave traders to Muslim countries. So this is just slaves coming over to the New World. And so the European landowners had bought different plantations in South America, the Caribbean, North America, and they needed laborers to work the land. At first, a lot of them enslaved Indians and forced them to work the land. A lot of them either died or fled, and so Europeans then had to find it somewhere else, and so they turned to Africa for their slave labor. They believed that because they were used to a hot climate and hard work, they could survive here, and so Europeans convinced themselves that the slave trade was a respectable way to farm the land. They really thought like there was nothing wrong with it, that they're lesser people and it's okay for me to enslave them. And so that's pretty much what they did. Not pretty much, that is what they did. So what they did, most of the slave traders were from Britain, France, and Portugal. They would anchor their ships off the western coast of Africa and pick up their human cargoes. African raiders would bring slaves from the interior to the coast. They a lot of times were held captive in chains, ropes, or yokes, and they were forced by the raiders to walk many miles to the coast. And sometimes, actually, especially there were different tribes and stuff that would war against each other, and they would kind of just take them as prisoners and then sell them. So it's kind of awful. So they have this harsh treatment, obviously, when they're in Africa, but when they get on the ships, it's even worse. The slave sea voyage proved to be even worse. They were crammed into these ships. They had decks that were too low to stand between, and they were often too crowded to move in. I think I showed you guys a video a couple chapters ago about the slave trade and these ships. It was just awful, absolutely awful, like sardines in a can. You just couldn't move. They also chained each slave to the ship because they didn't want to prevent their escape. On a lot of ships, they were chained to each other and to the ship. So if you can imagine, just not great. For months, it usually took 2 months for them to get there. They lived or died in these hot, filthy quarters, usually below deck. They didn't take them above deck. I think one of the books I read, they got to go for an hour a day. Can you imagine? That's it. Like, and I know like we're, in quarantine and we're stuck at home and it feels like, we're never getting out of here or we're stuck at home. But can you imagine being in these little tight quarters, chained to, think about like being in a tiny, tiny room in your house, chained to your family. And you're not allowed to leave your house at all. You're not allowed to go outside. You're just stuck. And that's not even as bad as these people had it. And so we can't even imagine what it was like. So, and in poor weather, they were kept below with absolutely no fresh air. As many as 25% of men, women, and children died before even getting here. And if you can imagine, they're all chained together. One of them dies or one of them is getting sick and you're still all chained together. So just, it's not great. It's actually horrific, the things that they had to go through. They entered the 19th century with a few powerful leaders in Africa that were engaged in supplying slaves to Europe and European and Muslim nations. And then when Europeans stopped participating in this practice, African states found some positive and productive ways to produce wealth. And by the way, some people over the years have said like the Bible says slavery is okay. That's what slave owners actually said back then, which is terrifying. They would take like a verse and take it out of context and stuff. And so our book has a note about justice. It says all people are required to obey God's law because of who he is. He has a right to command obedience from all people. Remember, all humans have rights and duties toward each other based on who they are because we're image bearers of God. We've been talking about that in chapel this year. God clearly states in Genesis 9 that humans have a right to life based on their position as bearers of the divine image. Because we are image bearers, we have a right to life. It also says this entails the duty of not murdering humans. That's one of the commandments. Humans also have a right not to be enslaved because stealing a man is stealing a life. So a duty exists not to steal humans or to buy stolen people. And that's why in the Bible, in Exodus and Genesis, it actually talks about the same penalty for murdering a man as for stealing him is the same, and it's death. So kidnapping or like stealing someone or murdering someone had the same consequences. So I think to God that they're the same thing. So just a little thing to think about. Okay, so after the slave trade, obviously things have to change. And so there were several states in Africa that had their own independence during most of the 19th century. Kings and chiefs continued to rule over expanding states, and there was a new modern Africa. They had trade in slaves that ends, thankfully, along the coast. And remember we talked about, I don't remember if it was last chapter, I think it was the chapter before, that the British Navy really helped stop the slave trade. And much of the African economy changed. They go from selling slaves to providing raw material needed for industrial countries. So they go from selling people to selling items, goods that people can use. So for example, they sold ivory, which is now illegal. It's like the tusks of elephants. They used it for piano keys, all kinds of things, jewelry. Yeah, it's not legal anymore because it has caused the decline in elephant, and I think rhino also has it. So it's caused a major decline in those populations, and so they don't allow it anymore. That was a big thing back then. Beeswax, they have huge bee populations there. Obviously, honey is then a part of it. Cotton is big there, and rubber. And I do have a note about natural rubber, and it's kind of like, I never knew this actually. You tap a rubber tree kind of like you do to get syrup out of a tree. Not syrup, what's sap, not syrup. Sap out of a tree so you can make it into syrup. They kind of do the same thing. There's a picture in your book. I don't know if you guys have your books open, so I'm going to show you. See this right here? They're tapping the tree to get the rubber out of it, which is kind of interesting. I do have a note that it was from a sap of certain trees that were growing in South America. Obviously, they also have it in Africa, and it was collected as it dripped from incisions made in the bark, and then it was refined into rubber. And it actually received its name when an English educator, Joseph Priestley, observed that the substance effectively removed or rubbed pencil marks from paper. So it was like an eraser. Although the French appear to have been the first Europeans to discover all of the properties of rubber, the British were the first to develop rubber on a commercial basis. There's a British explorer, Henry Wickham. He collected thousands of para rubber tree seeds from Brazil and then sent them to several British colonies, including in Indonesia and Singapore. And then they cultivated rubber trees, and India also developed a huge rubber industry. And if you can think about like all the things we use rubber for, you know, our tennis shoes, I think sports balls, aren't they made of rubber? All kinds of things, tires, all kinds of things. And so it's made a huge difference in the world. Another thing is palm oil, and that was the leading export because they used it to lubricate their machines. So as machines got slow, then they would oil them. Kind of like we have WD-40, they use palm oil for all of their stuff. And by the way, there is a picture of a oil palm tree, and then there's oil palm tree fruit. I had no idea that was a thing. So pretty interesting. So you can see the fruit here, and then there's the tree. So I hope this is interesting to you. I think it's super interesting. But okay, so obviously there has to be a transition in Africa. There were quite a few benefits. Sorry, my chair is really squeaky. I need some palm oil. So there were a lot of benefits. One of them is that in Africa, during the slave trade, I shouldn't say before, there was a lot of warfare and raiding of enemy tribes. That does not start with slavery, but it gets huge during slavery because people would invade other tribes for people they could sell. And so after the end of the slave trade, warfare and raids declined significantly, which is a huge thing. Another thing is that during the slave trade, the leaders of African tribes controlled the wealth. And so once slavery ends, there's just more of an improved distribution of wealth. More people have money, and more people are not stuck in poverty. Anyone could harvest natural resources, and so you could take advantage of that. It was a gathering-based economy, and so it allowed more Africans access to wealth that poured into Africa. A lot of the crops, we talked about like rubber and that kind of stuff, but there were also cocoa, which we love, right? And peanuts. So huge things, huge change there. Another thing is just an increase in the population, and so it's just more stable. There are peaceful conditions that allowed the tribes to settle in an area instead of having to migrate all the time. There was one place though that warfare did not go down, and that was in areas of West Africa that had been taken over by Islam. It just kind of they were still trying to take over other nations to bring the Muslim religion to new areas. Another thing is just the rural economy of Africa, because it used to be that trade and economy was just on the coast, and then we have that middle area of Africa that really develops and gets this new economy, and so more people got to trade and be involved in that. And then of course most important is just the status of just the man, like the African men and women themselves. They went from being treated as an object for sale to being a human being. Well, they were a human being before, but being treated as a human being, as they should. And they became a producer of merchandise and, workers and stuff like that. So just their worth to, I don't know how to say this. They were able to, I think can you imagine feeling, first of all, the fear of like being sold into slavery? Obviously they have more confidence that, their life is just more stable. And just knowing that obviously they knew forever that slavery was wrong, but being treated as equals and as human beings, because a lot of times they weren't. And so that's a huge change. Then we have just a unity of Africa. Before this time, Africa had been regional. Different areas were different things. The coast bordering the Atlantic Ocean had one market. The Mediterranean Sea had another. And so eventually these routes merged and unified. It was just then they had a large expansion of trade, and it brought a lot of wealth to Africa and its people. The old empires were crumbling, but new ones were growing. And some African states grew because of Islamic conquest we talked about. And two of those are the Sokoto, which is in Nigeria today, and then Tukulur, which is in modern Mali, are two that grew because of Islamic expansion. But Ethiopia and Egypt expanded by just taking over neighboring states. But even though there was even through conquest, they were able to move to unify, as they as Egypt took over a nation, they would start speaking Egyptian or whatever language they had changed to at that point in time. And they would bring their culture and their language to these new areas, and it kind of unified them. If you can imagine, it just brings them together and closer. Then obviously there's some modernization that happens. They have industry. They modernize by setting up factories. They develop, like in Egypt, they had textile and cotton mills, so all about cloth and fabrics. They also developed mills to process wood, make glass, produce paper. Some other states began to experiment with constitutional forms of government, so just bringing about a lot of change. Then we have military. So some, like Morocco, Tunisia, and Ethiopia, began to modernize their armies in anticipation of possible threats from European nations. So they wanted to be prepared in case a European nation tried to take over. So, for example, Menelik of Ethiopia replaced his poorly trained volunteer army with well-equipped and well-trained soldiers. Then he built factories to build modern military equipment. Then in West Africa, there was a General Samori Toure. He developed a modern army with current weapons to defend the Wasulu Empire. So they just kind of are getting ready to make sure they can, defend themselves. Then we have education and representation in Africa. Many Africans gained access to education, and they insisted on having a voice in their governments. They wanted to help run their governments. Some struggles did lead to violence, but most of them were able to transition without bloodshed. For example, states on the west coast of Africa won representation without violence. Then the Fanta Confederation formed along the coast of Ghana in 1868, and this organization was led by African pastors and teachers, and it provided an excellent example of Africans working to maintain self-rule and improve the lives of their people. So they ruled themselves and just really wanted to improve the lives of those people around them. And it produced a constitution that reflected a spirit of cooperation. It promoted male and female education, and it advocated for the development of African resources to benefit Africans. So it was to benefit themselves. So the goals of this organization were progressive. They wanted change. By the way, your code word for today is Fanta. So I don't know if it's Fanti. So anyway, so that's your code word for today. So make sure you send that in. It's in your book, but it's spelled Fante. And so they wanted to make sure that there was an education for all of their children. They wanted technical training, so like training and hands-on jobs. And they wanted it to be, they were self-reliant. They could rely on themselves to get everything that they needed. And this organization supported cooperation between educated Africans who tended to abandon traditions and those who retained African traditions. So they wanted to kind of blend, because some were kind of letting go of the old ways and the traditions, and some of them were holding on to them. So they kind of wanted to make it so that way it kind of didn't matter if you wanted the new way or the old way, it was blended. But unfortunately, conflict with the British and the Asante Empire, which is located in central Ghana, destroyed the possible attainment of these goals. And there is a box that says, even as the Confederation was forming, the British were determined to gain control over portions of the Gold Coast. You can imagine why. In West Africa. To solidify these gains, they purchased a Dutch fort that was along the coast. However, the Asante Empire had worked in cooperation with the Dutch, and they used this region to gain access to the coast. The British intrusion threatened Asante trade, and so they responded by invading this region, and the British dispatched well-trained soldiers and eventually forced the Africans to retreat. British forces seized control of this region in Ghana in 1873. This seizure by Britain forced the Asante Empire to submit to British control, and it also effectively ended this confederation that the people had started, unfortunately. So we are going to stop there, and then we will keep going with this section. It's just kind of long, so I split it in half. So we will continue with that on Friday. So I hope you guys have a good day. Don't forget to send me the code word, and I hope you're enjoying this chapter because I think it's just really interesting to learn about, because it's just not something I've ever studied before. So that's pretty interesting, and I hope you guys enjoy it as well. So have a good day. I will see you with a video on Friday. And make sure you get, I think you guys are taking notes. Take your notes tonight and get those sent to me. So see you guys later on Friday. Bye.